The helicopter blades whirred overhead as Harry Wales adjusted his combat helmet. The familiar weight of military gear replacing the ceremonial uniforms he had grown accustomed to wearing at royal events. The desert heat of Afghanistan hit him like a wall as he stepped off the transport aircraft at Camp Bastion, Helmand Province. For the first time in his 24 years, he was just another soldier. The young prince had fought tooth and nail to get here, while his older brother William continued his military training in the relative safety of Britain. Harry had pushed relentlessly for an active deployment. The army brass had initially been reluctant, citing security concerns and the potential propaganda value he might hold for Taliban forces. But Harry's determination, combined with his genuine military competence, had eventually won out. As he walked across the dusty compound, other soldiers barely glanced his way. Here, rank insignia mattered more than bloodlines. His fellow soldiers knew him simply as Cornet Wales, a young officer with the Blues, and royals who had earned his place through the same rigorous training as everyone else. The anonymity was intoxicating. The barracks he was assigned to were Spartanly functional. Metal bunks, basic lockers, and the constant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the Afghan heat. His bunkmates were a mixed group of soldiers from various backgrounds across Britain. There was Jenkins from Cardiff, whose thick Welsh accent made even simple conversations an adventure. Morrison from Glasgow brought an endless supply of dark humor that helped everyone cope with the reality of their situation. Thompson from Manchester never seemed to stop talking about football, creating elaborate fantasy scenarios about what his beloved United would accomplish while they were deployed. During those first few days, Harry discovered something he had never experienced before: the simple pleasure of being treated as an equal. When Jenkins complained about the terrible food, he included Harry in his grumbling without any special deference. When Morrison told crude jokes during downtime, he expected Harry to laugh along or contribute his own. When Thompson debated football tactics, he argued with Harry as vigorously as he would with any other football fan. The work was demanding and dangerous. As a forward air controller, Harry's job involved directing aircraft and coordinating air support for ground troops engaged with enemy forces. It required split-second decision-making, technical expertise, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Lives depended on his competence, and that weight was both terrifying and liberating. During his first week, Harry found himself lying in a foxhole at 3 in the morning, radio crackling with urgent communications from a patrol that had come under fire. His heart pounded as he coordinated with Apache helicopters circling overhead, providing precise coordinates and guidance that would determine whether British soldiers lived or died. In that moment, his royal heritage meant absolutely nothing. Only his training, his judgment, and his ability to perform under pressure mattered. The other soldiers began to accept him not because of who his grandmother was, but because he proved himself capable in the field. When he correctly identified enemy positions and successfully guided air support to neutralize a Taliban ambush, earning praise from his commanding officer, the respect he gained was entirely his own. It was a respect based on merit, competence, and shared danger rather than accident of birth. Evenings in the barracks revealed a side of military life that no amount of privileged upbringing could have prepared him for. The soldiers talked about their families back home with a mixture of pride and worry. Many had left behind young wives and children, uncertain about their futures. Others spoke about their motivations for joining the military, some seeking adventure, others escaping difficult circumstances, many simply wanting to serve their country. Harry listened to these conversations with growing understanding. Thompson showed pictures of his 2-year-old daughter, explaining how her first steps had happened while he was away. Morrison worried constantly about his mother's health problems and their family's financial struggles. Jenkins spoke proudly about being the first person in his family to travel outside Wales, though he admitted the circumstances were not what he had imagined. These intimate conversations taught Harry about sacrifice in ways his privileged education never could. He began to understand that for many of his fellow soldiers, military service represented not just duty, but economic necessity and limited options. The realization humbled him and made him appreciate the unique position he occupied, someone who chose to be there when he could have easily chosen otherwise. The physical demands of deployment were unlike anything Harry had experienced. The combination of extreme heat, challenging terrain, and constant vigilance created a level of exhaustion that seemed to penetrate his bones. Simple tasks like maintaining equipment, standing guard duty, and preparing for missions became tests of endurance and mental toughness. Yet within this harsh environment, Harry discovered an unexpected sense of purpose and belonging. Away from the cameras, the protocols, and the expectations that had defined his entire existence, he found himself becoming simply another young man trying to do his job well and keep his fellow soldiers safe. The transformation was gradual but profound, reshaping his understanding of himself and his place in the world in ways that would influence him for years to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan landscape as Harry crouched behind a concrete barrier, his radio equipment spread out before him. Intelligence reports had indicated increased Taliban activity in the area, and his unit was tasked with providing overwatch for a convoy moving supplies to a remote outpost. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders, but it was a weight he had learned to carry with growing confidence. 3 weeks into his deployment, Harry had settled into the rhythm of military life in a combat zone. The constant awareness of danger had become second nature, the way civilians might develop an automatic response to traffic patterns in busy cities. Every sound, every movement in the distance, every change in the normal pattern of daily life was potentially significant and demanded attention. His relationship with his fellow soldiers had evolved from cautious acceptance to genuine camaraderie. Morrison had started calling him Wales with the same casual familiarity he used for everyone else, a nickname that felt more authentic than any title he had ever held. Jenkins had begun including him in elaborate pranks aimed at maintaining morale during the long stretches between missions. Thompson had appointed him as an honorary member of his fantasy football league, complete with detailed explanations of why certain player selections were obviously brilliant or completely stupid. The work itself had proven more complex and demanding than Harry had anticipated. Modern warfare required not just courage and physical fitness, but technical expertise and the ability to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. During a typical mission, he might be coordinating with aircraft overhead, monitoring radio communications from ground units, consulting detailed maps and intelligence reports, and making rapid calculations about distances, timing, and tactical options. On one particularly intense morning, Harry found himself managing communications for a complex operation involving multiple aircraft and ground units spread across several kilometers of hostile territory. The Taliban had established positions in a village that controlled a crucial supply route, and British forces were tasked with clearing them out while minimizing civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. As the operation unfolded, Harry's radio crackled with rapid-fire communications from various units. Apache helicopters reported enemy movement in several buildings. Ground forces requested immediate air support after encountering heavier resistance than expected. Intelligence officers provided real-time updates about civilian locations that needed to be avoided. The complexity of coordinating all these elements while maintaining situational awareness and making split-second decisions pushed Harry to his mental and emotional limits. When one of the Apache pilots reported a mechanical problem that required immediate landing, Harry had to rapidly recalculate the entire air support plan while ground forces were actively engaged with enemy fighters. His training kicked in automatically, but the stress of knowing that any mistake could result in friendly fire casualties or mission failure created an intensity unlike anything he had experienced. The royal family had never prepared him for the weight of responsibility that came with decisions that could mean life or death for his fellow soldiers. When the operation concluded successfully several hours later, with Taliban positions neutralized and no British casualties, Harry felt a profound sense of accomplishment that was entirely his own. The praise from his commanding officer and the grateful nods from returning ground troops represented recognition earned through competence and dedication rather than inherited status. During quieter moments between missions, Harry began to reflect deeply on the contrast between his current situation and his previous life. The elaborate protocols of royal existence seemed almost absurd when viewed from a foxhole in Afghanistan. The carefully choreographed public appearances, the formal dinners with dignitaries, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies that had filled much of his calendar now appeared as theatrical performances rather than meaningful activities. Here, in the desert, meaning was immediate and concrete. Successfully coordinating air support saved lives. Maintaining equipment properly ensured mission success. Looking out for fellow soldiers created bonds of trust that transcended social class, education, or background. The work had tangible, measurable impact that could be evaluated without reference to tradition, protocol, or public relations considerations. His fellow soldiers had begun to open up about their own lives and motivations in ways that provided Harry with insights into British society that no amount of royal briefings could have offered. Thompson talked about growing up in a council estate where military service represented one of the few reliable paths to stable employment and career advancement. Morrison described his frustration with limited opportunities in his Scottish hometown and his hope that military experience would qualify him for better civilian jobs after his service ended. Jenkins shared stories about his community in Wales, where generations of families had worked in mines or factories that were now closed, leaving young people with few options beyond unemployment benefits or immigration. For him, the military represented not just adventure, but a chance to develop skills and experience that might allow him to build a different kind of life. These conversations challenged many of Harry's assumptions about British society and the role of institutions like the monarchy in addressing social and economic challenges. The disconnect between the privileged world he had always known and the reality faced by ordinary citizens became increasingly apparent. The physical environment continued to test everyone's limits. Sandstorms could reduce visibility to near zero and coat everything with fine dust that infiltrated weapons, equipment, and personal gear. The extreme heat during daytime gave way to surprising cold at night, requiring constant adjustment of clothing and gear. The threat of improvised explosive devices meant that even routine movements around the base required careful attention to establish safe routes and procedures. Despite these challenges, Harry found himself thriving in ways that surprised him. The clear structure of military life, the straightforward nature of objectives and responsibilities, and the immediate feedback about performance created an environment where he could focus entirely on becoming better at his job rather than managing public perceptions or fulfilling ceremonial obligations. As his deployment progressed, Harry began to understand that this experience was changing him in fundamental ways that would be difficult to reverse once he returned to royal duties. The authenticity of relationships based on mutual respect and shared risk was unlike anything he had known. The satisfaction of contributing meaningfully to important work was addictive. Most importantly, the simple pleasure of being valued for his own capabilities rather than his birth was something he knew he would struggle to give up. The satellite phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Harry was cleaning his rifle after a night patrol. His commanding officer approached with an expression that immediately told him something significant had changed. The conversation was brief and devastating. His cover had been blown. News outlets back home had discovered his deployment despite months of careful operational security, and his safety, along with that of his unit, was now compromised. The Taliban had put a bounty on his head within hours of the news breaking. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy fighters were already adjusting their tactics and targeting patterns specifically to capture or kill the British prince. Would have been a dangerous but manageable deployment had suddenly become an unacceptable risk not just for Harry, but for every soldier serving alongside him. The betrayal Harry felt was profound and multifaceted. Someone, somewhere in the chain of information had decided that a news story was more valuable than operational security and the lives of British soldiers. The careful arrangements that had allowed him to serve as an ordinary soldier were crumbling, and, with them, the most meaningful experience of his adult life. His fellow soldiers received the news with a mixture of shock, anger, and resignation. Morrison was particularly vocal about his disgust with journalists who would compromise military operations for the sake of story. Thompson worried aloud about how the increased attention would affect the safety of their upcoming missions. Jenkins, typically direct in his Welsh manner, simply stated that it was bloody stupid to put everyone at risk for newspaper sales. The conversations during Harry's final days in Afghanistan revealed the complex emotions his departure would create. His unit had come to rely on his skills as a forward air controller, and losing an experienced team member during an active deployment created both tactical and emotional challenges. Beyond the professional impact, genuine friendships had developed that would be difficult to maintain once he returned to his royal obligations. During his last week in country, Harry participated in a complex operation that would serve as an intense finale to his military service. Intelligence had located a high-value Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks on British supply convoys. The mission required coordination between multiple aircraft, ground units, and special operations teams across a large area of hostile territory. Harry found himself managing communications for the most complex operation of his deployment, with responsibility for coordinating close air support for ground teams while monitoring intelligence feeds, and maintaining awareness of rapidly changing tactical situations. The pressure was enormous, but his months of experience had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. As Apache helicopters moved into position and ground teams began their approach, Harry's radio erupted with rapid communications from various units. The Taliban commander had been located in a compound that also contained civilians, requiring precise coordination to avoid collateral damage. Special operations teams needed immediate air support after encountering unexpected resistance. Intelligence officers provided real-time updates about enemy reinforcements moving toward the area. The operation unfolded over several hours, with Harry serving as a crucial link between various elements of the mission. His ability to process multiple streams of information while maintaining clear communication with all units proved essential to the mission's success. When the Taliban commander was successfully captured and all British forces returned safely, Harry felt a profound sense of professional accomplishment. The success of the mission provided a bittersweet conclusion to his deployment. He had proven himself capable of performing at the highest levels of military operations, earning the respect and trust of professional soldiers who evaluated him based solely on competence and reliability. The recognition was everything he had hoped for when he first pushed for an active deployment. During his final evening at Camp Bastion, Harry's unit organized an informal gathering to mark his departure. The atmosphere was relaxed but tinged with sadness about the circumstances that were forcing his early return. Stories were shared about memorable moments from the deployment, pranks that had helped maintain morale during difficult periods, and the various ways Harry had contributed to the unit's effectiveness and cohesion. Thompson presented Harry with a signed football shirt from his beloved Manchester United, complete with personal messages from other soldiers. Morrison contributed a bottle of Scottish whiskey that had somehow survived military regulations and the Afghan heat. Jenkins offered a small Welsh flag that had accompanied him throughout the deployment, suggesting that Harry keep it as a reminder of their time together. The gifts were simple and practical, but they represented something precious that Harry had never experienced before: tokens of friendship and respect earned through shared experience and mutual trust rather than protocols of royal gift-giving. These mementos would become more meaningful to him than any ceremonial sword or official decoration he would ever receive. The conversation that evening revealed how profoundly the experience had affected not just Harry, but his fellow soldiers as well. Many admitted that serving alongside a member of the royal family had initially made them nervous or uncertain about how to behave. Over time, however, they had come to see him simply as another soldier who happened to have an unusual background. Morrison confessed that Harry's presence had initially worried him because he feared that any mistakes or inappropriate behavior might have serious consequences. As weeks passed, and Harry proved himself to be reliable and down to earth, those concerns had evaporated. Thompson admitted that he had initially planned to be formal and respectful, but Harry's genuine interest in football and willingness to argue about player performances had made normal friendship possible. Jenkins revealed that he had been selected for the unit partly because of his reputation for treating everyone equally regardless of their background. His commanding officers had wanted someone who would neither defer to nor resent Harry's presence, but would evaluate him based purely on his performance as a soldier. The strategy had worked perfectly, creating an environment where authentic relationships could develop. As the evening progressed, the conversation turned to what would happen after Harry's departure. His fellow soldiers would continue their deployment for several more months, facing the same dangers and challenges but without the additional security concerns that his presence had created. They expressed confidence that he had learned enough about real military service to understand and appreciate what soldiers faced in combat zones. The final morning arrived with a mixture of military efficiency and personal emotion. Harry packed his gear methodically, including the personal items his fellow soldiers had given him. The helicopter that would take him to the first stage of his journey home represented both safety and the end of the most authentic period of his adult life. As he prepared to leave, Harry understood that he was not just departing from Afghanistan, but from experience that had fundamentally changed his understanding of himself, his capabilities, and his place in British society. The young man boarding the helicopter was different from the one who had arrived months earlier, and those changes would influence every aspect of his future life. The transition from the dusty heat of Afghanistan to the pristine corridors of royal palaces felt like traveling between different planets. Harry found himself sitting in elaborate drawing rooms, surrounded by gilt furniture and oil paintings of long-dead ancestors, trying to explain to palace officials why his early return from deployment represented a profound loss rather than a fortunate escape from danger. The debriefings were extensive and necessary, but they felt surreal after months of direct, practical communication with fellow soldiers. Palace staff wanted detailed accounts of his experiences for security assessments, public relations planning, and future deployment considerations. The clinical nature of these discussions contrasted sharply with the immediate, authentic conversations he had grown accustomed to in military settings. Royal protection officers expressed relief that he was back safely, but Harry found their concern for his well-being difficult to appreciate when he knew his fellow soldiers were still facing the same dangers without the benefit of enhanced security measures. The disparity between his privileged safety and their continued exposure to risk created a persistent sense of guilt and frustration. The media attention surrounding his deployment and early return proved intense and largely negative. Newspapers that had exposed his presence in Afghanistan now criticized the military for allowing him to deploy in the first place, while simultaneously publishing detailed accounts of his service that Harry felt violated the privacy and security of his unit. The coverage focused more on royal drama than on the legitimate military work he had performed. Palace communication staff worked to manage the narrative, emphasizing his successful completion of military training and his genuine contribution to operations in Afghanistan. However, the public relations approach felt artificial and calculated compared to the straightforward recognition he had received from his commanding officers and fellow soldiers. Harry struggled to readjust to the formal protocols and ceremonial duties that filled his royal schedule. Public appearances that had once felt routine now seemed like elaborate theatrical performances. The scripted conversations with dignitaries, the carefully choreographed photo opportunities, and the endless rounds of ribbon-cutting ceremonies fell hollow after experiencing work that had immediate, measurable impact. During one particularly formal dinner with foreign diplomats, Harry found himself thinking about his former unit's current mission schedule and wondering whether they had encountered the enemy contact that intelligence reports had predicted. The contrast between his elegant surroundings and their basic field conditions highlighted the arbitrary nature of his privileged position. The psychological adjustment proved more challenging than anyone in the royal household had anticipated. Harry experienced what military psychologists might recognize as symptoms similar to reverse culture shock, but his unique circumstances made traditional support systems inadequate. He could not easily discuss his experiences with civilian friends who had no frame of reference for military service, and he had limited contact with military colleagues who could understand his specific challenges. Sleep became difficult as Harry found himself missing the constant background noise of military equipment and the presence of fellow soldiers nearby. The silence of his private apartments felt unnatural after months of shared living spaces. Dreams frequently transported him back to Afghanistan, sometimes featuring scenarios where his unit faced dangers without his support as their forward air controller. The sense of purpose that had defined his military service proved impossible to replicate in royal duties. Charitable patronages and ceremonial functions, while potentially beneficial to various causes, lacked the immediate urgency and clear objectives that had made military service so satisfying. The feedback mechanisms were entirely different. Success was measured in public relations terms rather than concrete outcomes. Harry began to seek ways to maintain connections with the military community and to find meaning in his royal role that might honor his Afghanistan experience. He increased his involvement with veterans organizations and military charities, though he recognized that his participation would always be somewhat artificial given his unique circumstances and the security requirements that surrounded his activities. Conversations with other members of the royal family revealed varying levels of understanding about his experience. Some relatives expressed polite interest, but seemed unable to comprehend why he felt frustrated about leaving Afghanistan early. Others offered well-meaning advice about channeling his military experience into appropriate royal duties, though their suggestions often missed the essential elements that had made his service meaningful. The relationship with his brother William became more complex as Harry struggled to articulate why his Afghanistan deployment had been so important to him. William's military training had followed a more traditional royal pattern, focused on ceremonial roles and leadership development rather than active combat deployment. The different nature of their experiences created a subtle distance in their previously close relationship. Media attention continued to focus on Harry's personal life and social activities, with journalists showing little interest in his growing involvement with military veterans or his attempts to find meaningful applications for his combat experience. The coverage often portrayed him as a party-loving prince who had briefly played soldier, a characterization that infuriated him and seemed to minimize the sacrifices made by professional military personnel. Harry found himself defending the competence and dedication of British soldiers in conversations with civilians who expressed casual opinions about military effectiveness or the value of operations in Afghanistan. His first-hand knowledge of the professionalism and sacrifice demonstrated by ordinary soldiers created a protective instinct that sometimes surprised him with its intensity. The friendships he had formed in Afghanistan became difficult to maintain due to practical and social barriers. His former unit members were scattered across various assignments, and the security protocols surrounding Harry's activities made informal contact challenging. The natural evolution of military friendships was complicated by the vast differences in their post-deployment circumstances. Attempts to stay in contact with Morrison, Thompson, and Jenkins through occasional phone calls or messages felt awkward and forced compared to the easy camaraderie they had shared in combat conditions. Harry worried that his privileged position would change how they related to him, while they seemed uncertain about appropriate boundaries now that he had returned to his royal obligations. The experience began to influence Harry's long-term thinking about his role within the royal family and British society. The satisfaction he had derived from being evaluated purely on his own merit created a desire to find ways to contribute meaningfully rather than simply fulfilling traditional ceremonial functions. However, The institutional constraints of royal life made significant changes difficult to implement. As months passed, Harry found himself increasingly drawn to causes and activities that had direct connections to his military experience. Veterans' welfare, support for military families, and advocacy for soldiers dealing with physical and psychological injuries became central to his evolving sense of purpose. While these activities operated within traditional royal frameworks, they provided some connection to the authenticity and meaning he had discovered in Afghanistan. Years later, as Harry sat in his California home, reflecting on the trajectory of his life, the Afghanistan deployment remained a defining experience that had set in motion changes he could never have anticipated. The young prince who had fought so hard to deploy as an ordinary soldier had discovered something about himself and about the nature of authentic purpose that would influence every major decision for the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath of his return from Afghanistan had been marked by a restlessness and dissatisfaction that palace officials had initially dismissed as temporary adjustment difficulties. However, as time passed, it became clear that Harry's experience of being valued for his own capabilities rather than his inherited status had created permanent changes in how he viewed his role and responsibilities. The friendships forged in combat had evolved in unexpected ways over the years. Morrison had completed his military service and used his experience to build a successful career in private security, occasionally sending Harry updates about his work and family. Thompson had returned to Manchester, where he established a veteran support organization that Harry quietly supported both financially and through personal involvement when possible. Jenkins had remained in the military, eventually achieving senior non-commissioned officer rank and serving multiple deployments. His occasional letters to Harry provided insights into how the Afghanistan conflict had developed and how British military strategy had evolved. These communications offered Harry a connection to ongoing military operations that his official royal briefings could never match. The professional relationships Harry had developed with his commanding officers proved more durable and influential than his palace advisors had expected. Senior military leaders who had observed his performance in Afghanistan became valuable counselors as he sought to find meaningful applications for his experience within the constraints of royal life. General Richards, who had overseen operations during Harry's deployment, became an informal mentor who helped him understand how to leverage his unique perspective for the benefit of military personnel and veterans. Their conversations provided strategic thinking about how royal influence could be applied effectively to support military families and advocate for improved resources for combat veterans. The psychological impact of the Afghanistan experience had taken years to fully understand and integrate. Harry eventually recognized that the deployment had shown him the possibility of a life defined by purpose and authentic relationships rather than protocol and public relations considerations. This realization created a persistent tension with traditional royal expectations that would influence his choices for decades. Working with military veterans became more than just a charitable patronage for Harry. It represented his most direct connection to the authenticity and meaning he had discovered in Afghanistan. Through organizations like Help for Heroes and the Invictus Games, he found ways to maintain relationships with the military community while using his royal platform to advocate for improved support services. The Invictus Games, in particular, represented Harry's attempt to channel his Afghanistan experience into something that could benefit wounded veterans while honoring the spirit of resilience and mutual support he had witnessed in combat. The international competition for wounded servicemen and women became his most personally meaningful royal project, directly connected to relationships and insights developed during his deployment. Veterans who participated in the Invictus Games often mentioned to Harry that they appreciated his genuine understanding of military culture and combat experiences. Unlike other royal patrons who expressed polite sympathy, Harry could engage with their stories from a foundation of shared experience, even if his circumstances had been unique. The media coverage of Harry's continued military involvement gradually evolved from superficial royal coverage to more substantive reporting about veterans' issues and military welfare. His credibility on these topics, earned through his Afghanistan service, allowed him to speak with authority about challenges facing military families and the importance of supporting combat veterans. However, the institutional constraints of royal life continued to create frustration for Harry as he sought to build on his Afghanistan experience. Traditional royal procedures moved slowly and prioritized avoiding controversy over achieving meaningful impact. The careful approach that protected the monarchy's reputation often conflicted with the direct action orientation Harry had developed through military service. The relationship dynamics within the royal family were permanently altered by Harry's Afghanistan experience. Family members who had not served in combat roles sometimes struggled to understand why the deployment remained so important to him years later. The experience had given him a perspective on leadership, sacrifice, and public service that differed significantly from traditional royal approaches. As Harry's personal life evolved, and he eventually married Meghan Markle, his Afghanistan experience influenced how he thought about the values he wanted to instill in his own children. The deployment had taught him about the importance of earning respect through personal actions rather than relying on inherited status, lessons he hoped to pass on despite their privileged circumstances. The decision to step back from senior royal duties in 2020 was influenced by the same desires for authenticity and meaningful purpose that had been awakened during his Afghanistan deployment. The experience had shown him what it felt like to be valued for his own contributions rather than his royal title, creating a permanent dissatisfaction with purely ceremonial roles. Looking back from the perspective of middle age, Harry recognized that his 10-week deployment to Afghanistan had been the most formative experience of his adult life. The relationships he had built, the competence he had developed, and the sense of purpose he had discovered in that desert environment continued to influence his choices and priorities years later. The young prince who had insisted on deploying as Cornet Wales had discovered that true satisfaction came from being judged on his own merits and contributing meaningfully to important work. That discovery, made possible by the unique circumstances of his Afghanistan service, had set him on a path toward a life defined by chosen purpose rather than inherited obligation. The desert heat and the weight of military equipment had long since faded from memory, but the lessons learned alongside Morrison, Thompson, Jenkins, and countless other ordinary soldiers continued to shape how Harry understood leadership, service, and authentic human connection. Afghanistan had given him a glimpse of who he could be when stripped of royal privilege, and that vision remained his guide for building a meaningful life beyond the constraints of traditional royal expectations. In quiet moments, Harry still sometimes missed the clarity of purpose and genuine camaraderie he had experienced during those intense weeks in Helmand Province. The relationships forged under combat conditions, the satisfaction of work that had immediate importance, and the simple pleasure of being accepted as an equal remained powerful memories that continued to influence his understanding of what constituted a life well lived.